everybody. This is David in a Vital Psychedelic Conversation with Bennet Zelner and Giles Hayward. Good greetings to both of you chaps. How you doing?
Hi, David. Great, thanks.
Good. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you got it. So Bennet, this is your second time on the show, and Giles, your first one. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. And first of all, I think maybe Giles, I want to tell folks, Giles is a student at Vital, our 12-month course, and we're coming to the end of it. So I want to hear about your experiences as a student, but also really hear a lot about the work that you're doing and how it's evolved over the last couple of years. So Giles, go just tell folks a bit about you, please.
Yeah, thanks, David. So by way of introduction, I'm Giles Hayward. I'm the co-founder and president of Woven Science and Woven's foundation, El Puente. And Woven's mission is to weave ancient wisdom with modern science to redefine mental health care. And we do that by backing and building leading psychedelic wellness and health tech companies with this vision really to try and, create a connected world where well-being is accessible to all. I come from a background of corporate finance, working in the emerging markets of China and Russia. I have a degree in psychology, so I always had a real fascination for human behavior. And kind of my odyssey with plant medicines started about 15 years ago, and it very much shifted my perspective on how I wanted to show up in the world, and it changed the course of my own life as well. I quit my job, moved to California, did an MBA in sustainability, where I learned how to use business as a way to solve some of our environmental and social troubles. And it was a deeply inspiring 2 years where I continued to work very closely with different entheogens, but also with non-psychoactive plant medicines. And when I finished my MBA, I very much wanted to stay in the health world and work with plant medicines. So I set up a health product company called Tory Labs, which used non-psychoactive plant medicines to balance, build, and brighten the body and mind. And that was really been the last 10 years of my life, been building these companies really with a holistic health perspective. So when the psychedelic kind of renaissance or industry started to emerge some 3 or 4 years ago, it was an opportunity too good to miss. I was able to stack all of my hats, use my kind of financial acumen, my entrepreneurial spirit, and my deep reverence and own personal odyssey with these psychedelic plant medicines as a way to hopefully contribute to the responsible evolution of this industry. And so, fast forward 3 years, Woven Science is an ecosystem of companies with 25 companies in our ecosystem. We launched one of the first psychedelic accelerator incubator programs with Founders Factory. We have invested into about 12 different drug development companies, taking 5 indications and taking 7 compounds, 5 compounds that are focusing on 7 indications, spanning the US and Europe. So really phenomenal companies. And then, we also believe very much in the power of technology to create a more affordable and accessible way to solve this mental health crisis. So that's, I think, hopefully enough, David.
Yeah, that's a good taster. Thanks, Giles. Yeah, want to hear loads more about that shortly. And Bennet, remind people about who you are and kind of what work you've been doing, and where does psychedelics come into it?
Sure. So my name is Bennet Zelner, and I'm a professor. I teach economics in the business school at the University of Maryland. And although I'm an economist, I'm what's called a regenerative economist, which is different from most economists. I think that kind of traditional economics is focused on explaining and in some way justifying the existing economic system and the existing institutional order. My interest is in transforming the existing system, and in particular, to transform it into one that's capable of balancing internally, balancing with other systems, balancing with social systems, balancing, and probably, extremely importantly, balancing with natural systems. And the way that regenerative economics tackles this problem, if you will, is through what's called a biomimetic approach. So the idea is to develop or help foster the emergence of economic practices and structures that are capable of balance, and in particular balance with natural systems, because they mimic the behavior of those systems. They operate according to the same principles. And we can do a deeper dive on what exactly that means in a couple of minutes if you want. In terms of my interest in psychedelics, my own journey from, and again, I could talk more about this too, but just briefly, my own journey from being sort of a more traditional economist to unfolding, if you will, into a regenerative economist is one that involves psychedelics. And so the psychedelic field, for a whole bunch of reasons, I think is a very natural place to apply regenerative principles and to help to foster the emergence of regenerative practices. And so when I really, I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about regenerative economic ideas for some time, and for a variety, for the reasons I just said, and for some kind of more idiosyncratic, because of some more idiosyncratic factors, I ended up kind of doing my first applied work in the psychedelic field. I have done a lot of work on what's known as the pollinator approach or the pollination approach. I've kind of gone back and forth between the two terms. I should probably settle on one. And I presented on that at lots of different psychedelics conferences. I've written on it. I've taught about it in this very course in Vital. And and today I continue to work as a professor, and I also serve as advisor or director for a number of organizations in the field that are interested in trying to bring forth and develop regenerative approaches to delivering psychedelic assisted mental health treatment.
Beautiful. And let's dive into it, Bennett. If we were to imagine a regenerative system, community, economy, where psychedelics are playing a role, and we're talking about balance on the individual level and the communal level, what might it look like? And feel free to be mildly utopian, but really grounded in what you believe is realistic in the systems that we currently live in.
Yeah. Well, I think in order to begin thinking about that vision, it's really important to first think about what is it what kind of a system do we have today, and I would characterize the system that we have today as an extractive system. It's a system in which all major structures and institutions have the effect, the purpose even, of extracting resources from bottom to top and from periphery to center to benefit one concentrated group, financial shareholders above all others. And the issue with this kind of system is that it can't survive. If you look at the way natural systems work by circulating resources. And these circulatory flows are necessary to keep systems in balance. The extractive pattern, which has been in place for thousands of years, this is not something new, has led to at this point what I think are major imbalances in all major systems. In economic systems, this is reflected in vast and ever increasing economic inequality. We clearly have great imbalances with natural systems, and these have led to ecosystem destruction, climate change, imbalances in our personal systems, if you will, which are manifested in epidemic and growing rates of anxiety, depression, suicide. So this is the current landscape. And I think I'm trying to think about how deep a dive to do here. Okay, so this sounds very grim, but I also think that it's actually created the conditions for change. If you look at the way that complex systems work, complex systems, one of the things they're best at is maintaining their existing state of equilibrium. So any sort of disruptive force comes along, they're great at kind of absorbing that force and colonizing that force and kind of staying the way they are. It's only when you get to a state of chaos or near chaos that the system sort of loosen up enough for a new pattern to emerge. So when we look at this kind of meta crisis that we're in, or this poly crisis as it's sometimes called, that the chaotic nature of life today is what creates the opportunity for the emergence of a new pattern. So I think the emergence, and now I'll start to answer the question. So I think this is obviously something that goes way beyond psychedelics per se. But I think that the psychedelic field has an important role to play in bringing forward a regenerative pattern for a couple of reasons. One reason is that if you look at the issues that psychedelic mental health treatment aspires to solve, if you again kind of the mental health crisis, I guess we could just use as kind of a summary term. I would argue that the roots of this crisis are cultural. It's the imbalances in the systems that surround us and include us that are contributing to a great deal of the mental distress that people currently feel. So if we were to deliver psychedelics using the same types of shareholder-centric extractive practices that are in some level contributing to these kind of epidemic rates of mental distress in the first place, we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. It would be counterproductive. The second reason is that one of the greatest sources of sustenance of the existing system is the fact that we take it for granted. We assume there can't be any other way. So this is the idea of the social construction of reality, in which we all engage in these habituated behaviors, and then these behaviors kind of add up to a pattern that we then accept as an external and immutable fact. Psychedelics have the ability to help people question their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. And people who've used psychedelics, I think, know this in many cases. There's also research out of Imperial College, some work by Chris Timmerman and co-authors that demonstrates this as well. So that's a second reason. And the third reason is that psychedelics also help people. They also help create well-being by opening people to connection with themselves, to connection with others, and to connection with the wider world. And this too is backed up by research. The research by Roz Watts and her colleagues has really focused on this. And I think the foundational myth of the current extractive pattern, the current system, is a myth of disconnection. Is this myth that we're not connected to each other and that we're not connected to nature. So I think psychedelics have a role to play by opening people to connection and helping them remember their connectedness to everything and everybody else. I feel like I still haven't gotten to the question, but I think that's kind of a good preamble.
Okay. Yeah.
Is that good for now?
Yeah. Let's take a dance down. We'll go down that path of just imagining it and building out that system. Maybe Giles, I want to come to you in a bit. I just want to jump with another follow-up question for Bennet about disconnection, the myth of disconnection. So just to make sure I'm understanding it, there's a lot of pathology right now. There is I believe there is a lot of disconnection that we feel, and that's causing a lot of our imbalance. And it's a myth to the extent that deeper down, and when we maybe deconstruct some of our axioms of cultural humanity and existence, we return to the connection that is actually still there and never went away. Is that part of how you're seeing it, if I understood it?
Yeah, for sure. I think that we undeniably live in a world of connected systems. I mean, I think that there's this one statistic which I hope I'll get it. I hope I'll get it exactly right. I think every 6 months, all the atoms in our body kind of recycle every 6 months. So we're literally sharing atoms. So our connection to each other and to the natural world, I think, is undeniable. To argue that we're not that our individual well-being does not depend on the health of the natural systems that we depend on for food, for air, for water is just folly, I think. But I think that, for a variety of reasons, and again, this requires a deeper dive if we want to do it at some point. But for a variety of reasons, there's been this mythology constructed that we are not connected to each other. That this kind of notion of hyper-individualism, which we see reflected in many places, and also this idea that the natural environment is a set of resources that are there for us to extract and use as productive inputs. So I think that deep down, everybody actually knows that we're connected, and psychedelics, and we've just been taught to forget that. We've been taught to forget that by many cultural forces. I think psychedelics can help us remember this innate wisdom. And people have used psychedelics will often tell you about experiences they've had where they just felt this, kind of remembered this interconnectedness they had to the entire universe. And again, there's also the research by Roz Watson and her colleagues that I mentioned, which finds that increases in psychological connectedness following a psychedelic experience are associated with reduction in clinical symptoms such as depression and with improvements in well-being. So
beautiful. All right, that's an awesome start. Thanks a lot, Bennet. Giles, you're super patient. Thank you, sir. What are some of the thoughts that you got brewing around this subject? We're talking about capitalism, systems, consciousness, kind of the cultural construction of our reality around illness and health and connection. So what are some of the things you're thinking of?
Yeah, thanks. It's a big question. I think that, from a mental health perspective, I think that loneliness is a key driver to many facets of mental health, or mental illness, I should say. And I think in our culture, Western culture, we've lost the capacity to connect to everything in our natural world. If we go back thousands of years, our ancestors, our pagan ancestors, believed in animism. We believed and saw that there was a spirit and an essence in everything. And yet today, we, through this reductionist mindset, everything, ever since Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," we have gone on this odyssey, which has fortified this understanding or this belief that we live in a separate existence, a separate world, where there's no room to see the world around us as being alive, full of spirit. And that's something that I think psychedelics, as Bennet said, can actually show us. I'm not sure whether any of the audience have ever, taken a psychedelic or worked with the plant medicine and gone into nature and been able to actually see, feel, even communicate with the natural world. And I think that capacity for us to develop intimacy with our surroundings is actually an innate potential that we all have. And yet society, our culture has bred it out of us. And I think one of the things that we need to incorporate into not only the work we do with psychedelics, but also the integration aspect of it, is that how do we continue to develop that sense of deeper intuition? Because if we're able to see the world as alive, if we're able to develop an intimate relationship with all things around us, one might think that this feeling of loneliness could dissipate somewhat. And there's a beautiful line from a poet called David Whyte. The poem is called "Everything is Waiting for You," and he says, "To feel abandoned is to deny the very intimacy of our surroundings." And I just want to just reiterate the fact that we all have this innate capability for deep connection. So that's one aspect. I think also one of the other kind of seeds that have very much embedded in our collective psyche is this feeling of scarcity, this understanding that society doesn't value us. It kind of needs us to become a function of productivity. So just to be in society is not enough. So we are kind of effectively born into a society that makes us feel like we're not enough. And it also makes us believe that we don't have enough, right? That what you have, I don't have, so I'm going to have to fight you for it. And I think most wars that we've experienced are based around this notion of scarcity. And so, as Bennet said, psychedelics do have the ability to kind of shift our mindset, our psychology, our psyche. But it does require, deep work following psychedelic experiences through that integration process, through rebuilding community. At Woven, we don't see psychedelics as a magic pill. In fact, we really firmly believe that we have to stand side by side with our clients and with the patients across the entirety of the treatment arc, and that the integration and the community part of that healing process is absolutely fundamental if we are to sustain mental well-being. I know that I think it's Sebastian Junger wrote in Tribe, and he spoke about veterans coming back and dealing with PTSD, and the correlation between successful remittance from PTSD was not related to the trauma or to any drugs or therapy they were given. It was purely related to the community they were coming back into. And part of the function of living in a world that believes we are separate from everything around us is that community is not valued, and so it starts to dissolve. So building strong communities, I very much felt that at Vital, by the way, the community that I've come into, the capacity to share, be vulnerable, be held in a safe space, to explore one's own inner journey has been a phenomenal part of what I've got from the course.
Thanks, Giles. And there's parallel levels that we're talking about. We're definitely talking about the personal, individual, like when we're coming back from a psychedelic journey and how we integrate that, how we're held by people, and our quest for regeneration or revelation or transformation. And on a societal level, hand in hand, like, is our society evolved enough to actually hold us? Like, can we trust it to be held? Are we safe to return from profound, healing, traumatizing, challenging experiences into this society that, for 70 years, 60 years, all psychedelics have been class A, and there's been lots of stigma and loads of people in prison and lots of people, especially with black and brown skin, that have been persecuted and discriminated against this. So how can our society change? And I question, can capitalism change? There are many iterations of capitalism. The one that we are in now, I personally call end stage capitalism, or kind of hyper capitalism. What comes next? So how can our society, and I guess maybe this is part of the Pollination Approach, Bennet, and you wrote that a while ago. So what have you seen? Maybe as a question, are we moving in the right direction? Like, are we getting closer to this? And if so, where and why and who and how is that happening? That is moving in that direction of something to, hang on to as a kind of a role model, proof of concept of what we can do collectively.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. I mean, there are different terms we could use to characterize this kind of current dominant form of capitalism. I call it extractive capitalism. I've also heard the term predatory capitalism. I guess one comment I would make is that, so part of your question was, can we even, is capitalism even viable, right? And I actually, I think you can make the argument that what we have now isn't really a system of capitalism; it's a system of financialism. So if you take a step back and you think, well, what if I were just kind of doing a thought exercise, and the question was, well, what does capitalism mean, or what should it mean? I would think a system of capitalism would be a system that respects the value of and tries to maintain the value of the capital assets that are necessary to produce things. And when I say capital assets, I'm talking, there's natural capital, there's human capital, there's social capital, there's physical capital, but we treat most forms of capital assets as expendable inputs. Right? So that doesn't seem to me to be very capitalist, right? The only we privilege one form of capital, which is financial capital. Financial capital isn't even a productive form of capital. You can't make something with money. Like it's not actually a capital asset. Okay, so that's the first thing. But the reason I say that is I do think that there's a form of capitalism that's possible, what I'll refer to as regenerative capitalism. And I think that this is something that one could argue we're moving towards. So to be more specific, you asked me about, what do I think has changed in the time since I started thinking about the pollination approach. So I started calling it the pollination approach and talking about it, kind of publicly, just at least at psychedelics conferences. And it was just a few years ago. It was in 2019. And I want to be really clear about saying that these ideas, these aren't just my ideas. These are like basic ideas from regenerative economics. And one reason that I think we should take very seriously what regenerative economics has to say is that the principles of nature are sacred. Whether we like it or not, we live in a world of natural systems. And if we're unwilling to operate and to behave, I should say, in a way according to the principles of natural systems, then the natural systems will survive. We're the ones who will not. And the concept of a pollinator is also a concept from regenerative economics. A pollinator is an organization, a business in many cases, that circulates resources to restore and strengthen the systems supporting our individual and collective well-being. And as I said earlier, that's not the pattern that we see right now. The structures that we have right now extract resources. So corporations, for example, extract financial resources from local communities where a lot of the value is produced to remote shareholders, to a small set of remote shareholders, just as one example. So a pollinator, it's obviously the idea of a pollinator is related to pollinator organisms which circulate nutrients and information in natural systems. And so to make this more concrete, I'll use the example of a financial pollinator. Imagine you have a community capital fund. And what that fund does is it allows local residents to take their savings and invest them into the fund, and the fund then invests them in local businesses, so that this local financial capital is circulating in the local ecosystem, if you will. So that's a natural systems concept, or a natural systems type of idea. In the context of mental health, or if we should call it the well-being space, because I think mental health is a little bit too narrow. A pollinator is an organization, a clinic of some sort, if you want, that circulates human capital by connecting people to community systems, by connecting people to community economic systems, by connecting people to community social systems. And it does so through activities in addition to kind of, quote unquote, regular therapy, group integration, other community building activities undertaking in partnership with other organizations in the community. And it's critical for helping people heal, because as we were discussing earlier, one of the main factors in many forms of mental distress is disconnection. So if you really want to help people, if you really want to create well-being and help people overcome their mental distress, reconnecting them to community systems is critical. The pollinator also helps to, replaces community institutions which have declined over the past 40 or 50 years. So there's actually research showing this. Is a famous book called Bowling Alone by the political scientist Robert Putnam, where he documents the decline in community institutions, labor unions, bowling clubs, you name it, in the US over the past half century or so. And so a pollinator in the space we're talking about steps in and assumes that role. Okay, so I don't think actually, 2019 to 2000 and I guess it's 2023 now. That's a very small. That's actually that's just a small bit of time. So going back to what I was saying at the beginning, I don't think anything has fundamentally changed. These same regenerative principles, which again are based in nature and are sacred and are as ancient as one can imagine, those certainly haven't changed. And although the field has the psychedelic field has certainly grown a lot, at least in terms of money pouring into it in that time, we still, decrim is really just beginning in a couple of states. We still don't have FDA approval of some of of what will probably be the first psychedelic compounds to be approved, psilocybin and MDMA. So yeah, I think it's way too early to say like, oh, this is working or this isn't working. So where I focus my efforts these days is on trying to support organizations, provide resources for organizations that want to kind of put some version of the pollination approach into practice. So I feel like I'm giving very long and maybe not super focused answers to your questions, but I hope that that got at your question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're working our way through this. I've got a very quick question, Giles, that I would then like you to expand on. Do you consider woven science to be a pollinator?
It's a great question, and we've spoken to Bennet for many years now. He's been a real ally, and what I would say is that woven science is trying its best to serve a function, doing it imperfectly, but I feel like it's the best maybe we can do, and we're always open to looking at new ways to evolve. But one thing I actually didn't really spend enough time focusing on was the foundation piece of woven science, which is El Puente, which means the bridge, obviously, in Spanish. And this foundation is focused on Indigenous biocultural preservation, because when we set up woven science, both myself and my business partner, Nick, believe very strongly that Indigenous communities should have a voice, but also have a capacity to benefit from any rewards that the psychedelic industry created. So El Puente will receive 10% of our equity at the Series A round for Woven Science. We're already, I think we've raised well over $200,000. Either it's come from Woven Science or outside sources, and we're taking our first expedition to bridge thought leaders within the psychedelic space with Indigenous communities in the Amazon. We're going down in April. It'll be a 10-day expedition where we'll be doing both inner and outer restoration. So we'll be working with Indigenous communities, with the Hunikuin. We'll be doing a cooking ritual with the Santi Daime and various other Indigenous communities as well. And then we will be there to get our hands in the soil and to launch our first ethnobotanical reserve, where we'll be planting the pioneer trees and also planting the master and teacher plants. So this idea of philanthropy not just being about giving money, but actually coming and understanding and being a part of the regenerative process is incredibly important both to us at Woven Science and also at El Puente. So I think that aspect maybe shows our desire and commitment to not only creating a level of reciprocity, but also to this regenerative aspect that Bennet so eloquently speaks about. Some of the other things that I think, when we think about creating a regenerative company, we talk about Woven Science being an ecosystem. And I think, Bennet, correct me if I'm wrong, but from my MBA days of learning about biomimicry, I believe that there are two fundamental principles that allow for a natural ecosystem to become resilient and for it to flourish, which is connection and biodiversity. And so what we're trying to do is build an ecosystem of companies that can then filter up information to create a kind of collective intelligence, so that all of the businesses in the ecosystem can benefit from all of this connection that we're creating. And we're actually speaking to one of our portfolio companies about doing a share swap. So actually they would own part of Woven Science, and then we would own part of them. So there's this kind of mutual alignment and shared mission, rather than things being separate from and funds just funding up. It actually circulates through the system. So look, in true humility, we recognize that this industry requires a huge amount of capital in order for it to evolve. The systems we have are imperfect, but we're trying our best to create a kind of more equitable system built on diversity, biodiversity, and deep connection within the ecosystem.
Beautiful. That sounds awesome. Thanks a lot, Giles. Yeah. There's another question in my mind that requires a pivot. So I invite you both to come with me and to the audience as well. When Bennet was talking about building ecosystems and communities that hold people that use psychedelics, and making sure it's community owned, it's like a local resource, I started to think about some of the ketamine clinics that I know that have sprouted up around America. And they're like a local clinic, They charge a lot of money. Some of it can be reimbursed through insurance, but, a lot of them are $600 to $1,000 a pop. I then started thinking about the MDMA MAPS piece. There are predictions of somewhere between $15,000 to $20,000 for a series of treatments, with 2 or 3 MDMA sessions. So these are really, really expensive. Is there a way for ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, whatever else is approved, to be affordable to the masses, especially when we keep in mind that a lot of people that have the most mental health or have experienced the most social determinants of health have the least ability to pay? So how do we kind of traverse that bridge? Just the reality of what we're seeing in the world. How are these going to be accessible medicines?
Yeah. Do you want me to, Giles, you want to jump in, or do you want me to?
Go shoot for it. I have my ideas. I'm sure they'll be relatively similar to what you want to say, Benedict. Go for it.
Okay. So, yeah, obviously I completely agree that access is a huge issue, and there are many, many traumatized people who would not have the financial means to pay the current prices under the current structures to receive ketamine, to receive treatment with ketamine, let alone with MDMA when that's something that becomes available. So I think there are a couple. I have a couple of ideas about this. First is the protocol that's being used. I think that there are huge benefits on multiple levels to group protocols. So with ketamine, for example, I'm actually working with an organization here in New York that plans to eventually offer group ketamine therapy. And on a purely economic level, now you can have one, or depending on the size of the group, you might have 1 or 2 therapists. You have a much more favorable ratio of therapists to participants. You might have some other people holding space, or you might have a nurse, but the cost per participant now becomes much less. But it's not just a kind of a financial play. I think there are huge benefits to actually doing work in groups. We were talking about disconnection and how that is, how that's intimately intertwined with a great deal of mental suffering. So doing work in groups where you can actually connect with others can actually be part of the therapy. And so in terms, we're talking specifically about access. Now imagine having groups where the groups are structured so that they include participants from different socioeconomic brackets who might not otherwise interact. Now you're building ties across these brackets. So what you're really doing is you're laying the groundwork for a more regenerative system, because you're creating this, you're densifying or complexifying the social network. And that could presumably, that I would not say presume, that would likely have kind of economic benefits as well, because a dense local social network gives rise to a more robust local economy. And then the pricing structure, the way the pricing structure could work is there could be cross subsidization. So those who have greater means might pay a bit above cost, and that will allow those who don't have, whose financial means are lesser, to pay lower prices. There might even be some, I don't like to use the word scholarship, but just to give you the idea, a couple of scholarship spots in each group. And I think it's critical. Well, it's not critical. I think it's actually helpful that it's participants in the group who are helping who are actually engaged in the cross subsidization, because what you're doing is you're building multiplex ties to further develop the community. Okay, so that's one idea. I think it's a very promising idea. I had another thought that I wanted to share, and it's now not coming to me, but I can come back to it. Giles, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, look, all to say that everything you said, I completely agree with. I think those are some of the techniques and mechanisms by which to make these medicines more affordable and more accessible. Certainly with the companies that we work with, like the retreats company we're about to work with, they're already in discussions around creating at least one or two of the spaces will go to people at a much lower cost bracket to make sure that there is an affordability piece baked into it. I think technology has a real place to play in creating more affordable, accessible means to these medicines too. We think about most of the costs with these things is around the preparation and the integration. And there are incredible tools that we can use online through apps, which can lower the cost to kind of maintain some of the benefits we get from these medicines. Look, again, I think one of the saving graces of the medicalization of these compounds is that it will hopefully lead to the reimbursement of for these medicines. So I know that's quite a long way off, but it will at some point hopefully create real accessibility to these medicines. I believe, I might be wrong, that some people are already reimbursing for ketamine. Bennett, have you heard that?
I know of at least one, and there could be more. This is just anecdotal, obviously, but I know of at least one insurer who's giving fairly substantial reimbursement rates for, at least for IV ketamine, in the New York area. Yeah, so I think that's happening, and I have some additional thoughts around insurance too. But did you have more you wanted to?
I think we're good. Yeah. You really answered the question perfectly.
Yeah. The only thing, the thing I was going to add is that it's even at the current rates, $500, $700, and then David, you were mentioning that under the current protocol, at least, the MDMA treatment would be considerably more expensive than that. There are huge costs to having people suffer from afflictions like depression, anxiety, and addiction. So first, there are just the costs of continuing to pay for kind of the current treatment approaches, which are in many cases giving them antidepressants or some cocktail of drugs, which might go on for their entire life. But in addition, these people have much higher, what are referred to as comorbidity costs. So someone who's depressed or anxious typically has much larger physiological healthcare costs in addition to the costs of treating their depression or anxiety. And so those all need to be paid for as well. And then because these people are often, or at least in some cases, unable to be quote unquote fully productive members in of the economy, there are also there's the reduced economic productivity of these people. There might also be what are typically referred to as welfare costs of local, state, or federal programs to support people. So there's all these categories of costs. When you take them all into account, $500 to $700 a session, or even $10,000 for a treatment that might have beneficial effects for many years or even a lifetime, doesn't actually sound like that much. So a lot of it is and this is, I won't go too much into this now. We can talk about it more if you want to, but I think a lot of it is in shifting the current set of structures, including insurance structures, so that they take into account these long tail of costs that might extend several years, to a lifetime, and that's not currently the case. The average in the U.S., the average spell, as it's called, so the average amount of time that someone is with a given insurer is something like 3.5 years.
Yeah, so in America, that's going to be tricky to have the benefits outweigh the costs if an insurance company is only providing insurance for a few years because your job changes or your employer switches plans. Whereas in Europe, where you have like social medicine, there's more of an incentive to have your citizenry well, because it's worth investing in. And that really is pollination, where the government, your local, council, health systems have that bigger incentive to be well.
Yeah, and that is interesting. I mean, I wonder what the NHS is spending on mental health on an annualized basis. I'm sure it's huge. I had really appreciated that aspect, Bennett, that the insurance companies only really look three or so years out because that's the typical cost per patient.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that's clearly that's not an easy problem to solve, but there are lots of good reasons why the healthcare system in the U.S. needs to be reformed.
I mean, it might not come through insurance companies, but I was told the other day that there are hospitals that are having to spend $3,000 a day looking after people who are suffering from opioid addiction or from the pharmaceutical drugs that are being sold for pain, costing $3,000 a day. The quote from the head of the hospital is like, it's more cost effective for me to set up a hotel to house these people or to buy a hotel than it is to keep them in the hotel. So maybe there is a way for these people to start to get incentivized to support these types of treatments. If you can, have a half decent potential to solve addiction by the use of ibogaine as an example, imagine the cost that you would be saving these hospitals that are crippled by these costs.
I feel like one important piece to really hone in on now, guys, is around the drugs themselves, medicines. It takes hundreds of millions of dollars to get these approved, to go through all the clinical trial process. So a lot of the companies are going to go bankrupt that are trying to do this in the psychedelic space. Some will make it work, and then they're going to need, have IP and charge lots of money for that. And I'm also really aware of what's going on in Oregon and Colorado, that there's going to be statewide systems, infrastructures that, in a sense, supersede or transcend the FDA process. And I'm also aware that, Giles, you live in Portugal. You're putting on a great English accent today, by the way, but yeah, Portugal's got its own, system around, drug classification, decrim, legalization. So, and I guess the question I want to start on this piece with, and we've only got maybe 10 minutes, guys, but Bennet, just real quickly, your article for Double Blind, what's the answer to the question of the title of this article? So the title is Psychedelic Pharma Has Arrived, but will it really be different from Big Pharma? So what in a nutshell was your answer to that question? And then yeah, let's kind of go from there.
Well, I mean, the funny thing, that article, so that's the web version of the article that just came out. And there was a slightly different title on the print version, which came out about a year ago. And that it was regenerative patterning and psychedelics. And then the kind of question, the subheading was, I don't remember, I'm probably getting a few of the words wrong, but basically, can we break out of an outdated and extractive medical model, which is what the current approach is often called. So the reason I mention that is that article, it's not really about pharma. It's more about regenerative patterning. So what does regenerative patterning look like? Some of the ideas that we've been talking about here today, and then how would it show up in the delivery of care versus in the in the pharma segment, which is what you're talking about. But so let me use that as a jumping off point, because I think that some of the emphasis on pharma per se, on developing new compounds, is misplaced. We already have some pretty good compounds. I mean, MDMA and psilocybin. I understand, like, some of the companies, mescaline. I understand that it might be possible to create compounds that have slightly more desirable properties because they're slightly shorter acting, and maybe that's could be a little bit more economical, or developing compounds that people who take SSRIs can take. There are concerns about, at least about taking MDMA with SSRIs. But putting aside a couple of those special cases, I think having all this money that's pouring into the into drug development seems to me to be, in many cases, it's kind of a Wild West mentality, and it's driven a lot by investors chasing large returns. If we actually think about creating well-being and what's that going to take, again, I think we have some really good compounds. I think what we should really be focusing our attention is on delivery, and that's first of all, that's what the pollination approach is about. It's about the delivery of mental health treatment. And I think if we don't get the delivery piece right, we're going to be disappointed. There's this idea that out there that psychedelics can be like a magic bullet. Like, you're depressed, you go do a couple of sessions with psilocybin or whatever, and your depression can be lifted, for your life. As Giles was saying, it's not that simple. It's not. First of all, the set and setting really matter. The therapy that you get really matters, and then the integration. The integration is so critical, and that's not something where it's not integrated. When I say integration, I don't mean you go meet with a therapist 3 times after your session and you're done. Integration has to be an ongoing process, ideally one that's done in community. So I think that it would be much more economical to focus resources, to focus a lot of the resources that are now going into drug development in these areas. If we're going to just put it into purely financial terms, I think I was going to say you get a lot more bang for your buck, but that's if the bang you're talking about is making people feel better versus enriching shareholders. So,
yeah, can I add? I just, there's the whole conversation around hallucinogenic versus plastogenic psychedelic compounds, and I think the way I've been heard it kind of described to me by actually Dr. David Nutt is that there might be some neurodegenerative properties and capabilities of the plastogens, neuroplastogens, which could be very beneficial. But when it comes to actually trying to treat psychological or psychiatric disorders, that the psychedelic experience is fundamental to it. And that's really kind of where I lie. I think there might be some potential positive aspects to the neuroplastogenic compounds. I think in defense of the pharma model and the medicalization model is that there could potentially be, I think we've seen potentially a level of mainstream appetite and appreciation and acceptance of psychedelics because they are going through the FDA approval. And I think there will be people who just wouldn't look at or accept psychedelics as a valid form of medicine without the FDA approving them. I don't know how big that population is, but could be quite large. When you're dealing with very vulnerable populations, like having a very structured way of administering these medicines, these compounds, I think is going to be very important. So the psychedelic assisted therapy piece is just fundamental. As Bennet said, the integration, the delivery, how you do this is so important. And maybe, for people who are really suffering, maybe a hyper-medicalized model might work better for them than some indigenous shamanic practice. Again, this is all, I don't have the answers to this, but I'm just offering up some potential. I guess what I'm saying is that I think all of these things actually can work synergistically together, provided they're allowed to. I very much believe in the kind of the legalization model that Oregon are implementing. I think it's going to serve a real purpose. Decrim will also provide opportunities for people to hopefully use these medicines in a responsible way, which is why developing the ancillary services and tools that allow people to be educated and also use these compounds respectfully is going to be so important. It's why Woven takes a very holistic approach to this. Like, we have a whole wellness company based in New York, David, in your stomping ground, called The Alchemist Kitchen, which looks at a lot of these non-psychoactive plants in terms of how do we use these for preparation and integration and general well-being and health. So yeah, all to say, I hope that all of these things can work together. I don't want one to prohibit the other, which is where often kind of things like IP can come in. I don't believe that you should be allowed to patent a naturally occurring compound. I know that there are certain ways that people are trying to do that. But to talk about next generation compounds, we're a big advocate of a company, a Swiss drug development company, they've engineered a combination product of DMT and beta-carbolene, which are the two compounds in ayahuasca. But with the way they put it together, they've actually created a very standardized experience. So they've reversed it, or they've engineered out a lot of the side effects, like the nausea and the vomiting. For us who've worked with ayahuasca, we'll see that as a negative, because actually the purge is a real positive aspect of the healing process. But if you can imagine somebody from a vulnerable population who's suffering from anxiety or some indication that would really be it would be too much for them to go and do an ayahuasca experience. So these guys have developed a technology, and by the way, doing it with deep reverence for indigenous communities. They have given 20% of their founding equity to their foundation, which is, again, looking at indigenous biocultural preservation. They've actually funded one of El Puente's first projects. They're an amazing company called Regenerative. So I think there's nuance to this conversation. My hope is that all of these things can evolve and work together to bring as many of these compounds to those people who genuinely need them.
Awesome. Thank you, Giles. And I think we're going to wrap. Before we do, I briefly, Giles, want to just ask you, as a Vital student, what's been your experience over the last 11 months? Like, what have you gained as a business owner and as a human being?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a phenomenal experience. Like, it's exceeded my expectations on many levels. Look, as somebody who tries to understand from a macro perspective, how can I help support the responsible evolution of this industry? It would be irresponsible of me, I feel, not to understand what's happening on the front lines. Like, what are people actually being taught? What are therapists and facilitators actually learning in terms of what it is to be a responsible facilitator of these medicines? So, and I feel that Vital have done a really incredible job at looking at this this training in a very multifaceted way. I love the fact there's a lot of emphasis on plant medicine, but we also obviously look at the kind of non-plant medicine compounds as well. There's a big focus on integration, which is where I'm most interested in, what I'm most interested in, and the community and the friendships that I've built, and also the room for my own personal evolution and transformation has been quite exceptional. The retreat we did in Amsterdam was really very powerful for me, and it was held beautifully, and it's just all in all been a phenomenal experience. So, David, thank you so much for taking the time to put this all together with your team. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been amazing. I wish I could have been on retreat myself next year. I hope so. Thanks, Giles. And Bennet, thank you for being one of our teachers. You're coming back for year 2, which is wonderful. Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Just to sign out, tell people where they can find you if they want to connect or learn more about your work. Bennet, if you want to go first.
Sure. Probably the best, thanks for that, David. Probably the best place is to look at my LinkedIn page, and I can also be reached that way. You can, so if you want to see some of my articles or talks, or just send me a message, LinkedIn.
Yeah, and for us, you can go to our website, which is woven.science. We also have our LinkedIn page, which is Woven Science. And then El Puente website is foundationelpuente.org. And you can also follow our projects on Open Futures Coalition or Open Impact. It's all documented there. But yeah, the website's best place to really learn more.
Lovely. All right, thanks a lot, guys. I kind of feel like we scratched the surface. There's still loads more we didn't go into. But yeah, this is evolving and kind of slowly. There's lots of rapidly evolving things. But yeah, I think we're focusing on the long game here. So let's just keep talking. Giles Hayward and Bennet Zelner, much obliged. Thanks for listening, everyone. God bless.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.